The moment I realized I had become invisible at my own daughter's school event, I knew something was deeply wrong. The morning had started perfectly. I woke up before my alarm because I was too excited to sleep. My daughter Sophie was receiving a special academic recognition at her elementary school, and for weeks she had been counting down the days until the ceremony. I had marked the date on every calendar in the house. I had taken time off work. I had even bought a new memory card for my camera because I wanted to capture every second. As a mother, there are certain moments you imagine long before they happen. Watching your child walk across a stage to receive an award is one of them. Sophie was only 8 years old, but she had worked incredibly hard. Every evening after dinner, she sat at the kitchen table finishing assignments while I helped her review spelling words and math problems. I remembered the frustration on nights when homework felt overwhelming. I remembered the excitement every time she brought home a good grade. Most of all, I remembered how proud she looked when she learned she had been selected for recognition. This was her achievement, and I wanted to celebrate it with her. By 8 o'clock that morning, Sophie was dressed and ready. She wore a navy blue dress and a bright smile that seemed impossible to contain. My husband David was running late as usual, but I did not let it bother me. Nothing was going to ruin this day. Before leaving, I picked up a small bouquet of flowers that I planned to give Sophie after the ceremony. It felt like a simple gesture, but I knew she would love it. When we arrived at the school, the parking lot was already crowded. Parents were carrying cameras, grandparents were gathering near the entrance, and children were running excitedly through the hallways. The atmosphere felt joyful and energetic. Exactly what a school celebration should feel like. Sophie hurried off toward her classroom while I made my way toward the auditorium. As I entered the building, I noticed something strange almost immediately. Several people were gathered near the front entrance speaking with my mother-in-law, Margaret. That part was not unusual. Margaret attended nearly every school function. What felt unusual was the way people were speaking to her. One woman smiled warmly and said, "You must be so proud of your daughter." Margaret laughed softly and thanked her. "Daughter?" I assumed the woman had simply misspoken. The comment seemed harmless enough. A few moments later, another parent approached Margaret. "Congratulations. Sophie is such a wonderful child. You must have done an amazing job raising her." Again, Margaret smiled and accepted the compliment. She never corrected the assumption. My stomach tightened slightly. Maybe she had not heard clearly. Maybe it was awkward to interrupt. I tried to dismiss the feeling and continued toward the auditorium. Yet as I walked farther into the building, the same thing happened again. A volunteer handed Margaret a program and said, "We have reserved seats near the front for parents." Margaret thanked her and accepted the program without hesitation. I stopped walking. Something about that exchange felt wrong. Not because Margaret loved Sophie. She absolutely did. Not because she attended school events. Many grandparents did. It was the fact that nobody seemed to recognize who I was. Several people smiled politely at me as I passed, but none of them treated me like Sophie's mother. Meanwhile, Margaret was receiving all the attention normally directed toward a parent. I finally convinced myself I was overthinking things and entered the auditorium. Rows of chairs filled the room. Decorations lined the stage. Families were finding seats and preparing cameras. Then I noticed Margaret already sitting near the front in a section clearly marked for parents and guardians. The seat beside her was empty. Before I could approach, a teacher walked over and smiled at Margaret. "We are so excited for Sophie's big day." Margaret beamed with pride. Then the teacher added a sentence that made my heart stop. "You must be her mother. She talks about you all the time." And Margaret did not correct her. For several seconds, I honestly thought I might have misunderstood what I heard. The teacher's comment echoed in my mind while I stood frozen near the aisle. "You must be her mother." It was not a vague statement. It was not an assumption made from a distance. The teacher was standing directly in front of Margaret and speaking with complete confidence. More importantly, Margaret simply smiled. "She is a wonderful child," she replied warmly. My stomach dropped. The correction never came. The teacher nodded enthusiastically. "We all adore Sophie. She is one of the kindest students in her grade." Margaret thanked her again. The conversation continued as though nothing unusual had happened. I remained where I was, unable to decide whether I was angry, embarrassed, or simply confused. Eventually the teacher walked away. I expected Margaret to notice me and explain what had happened. Instead, she waved cheerfully and motioned toward the empty seat beside her. "Emily, there you are." Her tone sounded completely normal, as though I had not just witnessed something deeply uncomfortable. I walked over and sat down. "Did you hear what she said?" I asked quietly. Margaret looked surprised. "Who?" "The teacher." Margaret shrugged. "Not really. There was a lot of noise." The answer felt rehearsed. Convenient. Before I could respond, the auditorium lights dimmed and the ceremony began. Students entered in small groups while families applauded. I forced myself to focus on Sophie. This was her day. I refused to create tension during an event that meant so much to her. Yet the strange interactions continued. Throughout the ceremony, multiple teachers and volunteers approached Margaret. Several greeted her by name. Some stopped to congratulate her. One even thanked her for always being so involved. Each conversation left me more unsettled than the last. I had volunteered for field trips. I attended parent conferences. I completed homework projects. I filled out forms. I signed permission slips. Yet somehow I felt like a stranger watching someone else receive recognition for my role. Then came the moment Sophie walked onto the stage. The audience erupted into applause. My heart immediately filled with pride. She looked nervous but excited as she accepted her certificate. I raised my camera and started taking pictures. At the same time I noticed movement beside me. Margaret had already stood up. She moved closer to the aisle and began waving enthusiastically. Sophie smiled in response. Nothing unusual about that. Grandparents love supporting their grandchildren. What happened next was different. After the awards ended, several students were invited to take photographs with family members near the stage. Parents gathered around excitedly. I grabbed the bouquet of flowers and headed forward. As I approached the photography area, I noticed Margaret already standing beside Sophie. A school photographer smiled at them. "Perfect. Mom and daughter right over here." My feet stopped moving. Again, the same mistake, the same assumption. This time, however, the words were impossible to ignore. I watched Margaret closely. She laughed softly and placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. Once again, she never corrected anyone. The photographer snapped multiple pictures before I finally reached them. "Actually, I am Sophie's mother," I said politely. The photographer immediately looked embarrassed. "Oh my goodness. I am so sorry." He apologized several times. I assured him it was fine. Yet inside, nothing felt fine. Not anymore. As soon as the photographs ended, Sophie hugged me and accepted the flowers. Her excitement helped ease some of the hurt. For a while, I focused entirely on her happiness. We celebrated with cookies in the cafeteria and listened as she excitedly described every detail of the ceremony. Eventually, families began leaving. While Sophie chatted with classmates, I found myself standing beside another parent near the exit. She smiled warmly. "You must be Sophie's aunt."
Ist daher?
"No. I am her mother." The woman's face immediately turned red. "Oh, I am sorry. I thought Margaret was her mother." For the third time that morning, someone had made the exact same mistake. 3 different people. 3 separate situations. The pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss. As I drove home later that afternoon, Sophie happily talking in the back seat, one question refused to leave my mind. Mistakes happen. But how had so many people at the same school come to believe that Margaret was Sophie's mother instead of me? The question stayed with me for the rest of the weekend. Every time I replayed the school event in my head, another detail seemed to stand out. One mistaken assumption might have been understandable. 2 could have been coincidence. But 3 different people making the same mistake suggested something else entirely. By Monday morning, I could not stop thinking about it. After dropping Sophie off at school, I sat in my car for several minutes staring at the building. Children hurried through the entrance while teachers greeted families near the sidewalk. Everything looked perfectly normal. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something had been happening right in front of me for years without my noticing. Later that evening, I brought the subject up with David. We were cleaning the kitchen after dinner while Sophie worked on a science project at the table. "Did anything seem strange to you at the ceremony?" I asked. David looked up from the dishwasher. What do you mean? I dried a plate and tried to choose my words carefully. Several people thought your mother was Sophie's parent. David shrugged. People make mistakes. The answer immediately frustrated me. 3 different people? He paused. Maybe they see her around the school a lot. That explanation made some sense. Margaret did help occasionally. She picked Sophie up from school when David and I were working late. She attended some events. She volunteered a few times over the years. Yet something still felt off. Do you think she ever tells people she is Sophie's mother? I asked. David laughed. Of course not. The confidence in his voice surprised me. How can you be so sure? Because that would be ridiculous. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was overreacting. For a moment, I almost convinced myself to let it go. Then another memory surfaced. Last year during a school fundraiser, a volunteer had thanked Margaret for raising such a polite child. At the time, I had dismissed the comment because the room was noisy. Months earlier, a teacher had asked if Margaret would be attending a parent workshop. Again, I had not thought much about it. Suddenly those moments looked different. They no longer seemed random. They seemed connected. The following week, another incident occurred. Sophie came home carrying a flyer about an upcoming reading competition. As I looked through the paperwork, I noticed a handwritten note clipped to the front. The note read, "Margaret, thank you for helping Sophie prepare. We look forward to seeing you next month." My heart skipped a beat. Not Mrs. Parker. Not Sophie's grandmother. Margaret. The familiarity felt unusual. I turned the paper over and searched for a name. It was signed by one of Sophie's teachers. That evening, I casually asked Sophie a question. Does Grandma visit your classroom often? Sophie looked up from her homework. Sometimes. What does she do when she visits? Sophie shrugged. She talks to my teachers. About what? Mostly about me. The answer was innocent. Completely innocent. Yet it made me uncomfortable. Do your teachers know she is your grandmother? Sophie thought for a moment. I think so. Think so. Not know so. Think so. That distinction stayed with me. 2 days later, I found myself volunteering at the school library for a reading event. It was the first time I had spent several hours inside the building since the ceremony. As parents and students moved through the library, I noticed something unexpected. More than one staff member greeted me politely but seemed unsure who I was. One office assistant even asked whether I was related to Sophie. Related. Not mother. Related. The pattern was continuing. Near the end of the afternoon, I helped organize books alongside a teacher named Mrs. Reynolds. She had worked at the school for years and knew Sophie well. As we sorted materials onto shelves, she smiled and said something that immediately caught my attention. Your family is wonderful. I smiled back. Thank you. Mrs. Reynolds nodded. Margaret talks about Sophie all the time. You can tell how proud she is of her daughter. My hands froze on the stack of books. Daughter. Not granddaughter. Daughter. The exact same misunderstanding again. Except this time, I was standing directly beside someone who had known Sophie for years. And for the first time, I decided I was not going to let the comment pass without asking a question. My heart skipped the moment I heard the word daughter again. This time, however, I was not standing across a crowded auditorium or listening to a passing comment from a stranger. I was standing directly beside a teacher who had known Sophie for years. If anyone could explain what was happening, it was Mrs. Reynolds. I forced a polite smile and carefully set another stack of books onto the shelf. Daughter? I asked gently. Mrs. Reynolds looked at me with mild confusion. Yes. The expression on her face suggested she genuinely believed there was nothing unusual about the statement. My pulse quickened. Margaret is Sophie's grandmother. Mrs. Reynolds blinked. Oh. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on her face. I am sorry. I thought. Her voice trailed off. I waited. Thought what? Mrs. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. I guess I assumed she was her mother. There it was again. The exact same misunderstanding. Except now I had the opportunity to ask the question that had been bothering me for days. Can I ask why? Mrs. Reynolds hesitated. I am not sure. The answer sounded honest. Then she frowned slightly as though trying to remember something. Margaret has always been very involved. More involved than most grandparents? I asked. Mrs. Reynolds nodded slowly. Much more. As we continued organizing books, she casually mentioned several school activities I had never heard about. Margaret had attended planning meetings. She had participated in volunteer discussions. She had spoken with teachers numerous times throughout the year. None of those actions were necessarily inappropriate. Yet the frequency surprised me. Even more surprising was the fact that many staff members apparently interacted with Margaret more often than they interacted with me. On my drive home, old memories started resurfacing. I remembered the preschool orientation where Margaret insisted on coming with us. I remembered parent-teacher conferences where she somehow ended up speaking more than I did. I remembered birthday parties where guests occasionally assumed she was the primary caregiver because she answered questions before I could. The time each incident seemed too small to challenge. Looking back, however, they formed a pattern I had ignored because confronting it felt uncomfortable. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table after Sophie went to bed and opened an old photo album stored in a cabinet. Page after page revealed something I had never noticed before. School performances, soccer games, reading events, science fairs. In nearly every photograph, Margaret stood front and center. Sometimes she stood beside Sophie. Sometimes she accepted flowers or certificates on Sophie's behalf. Sometimes she appeared in positions usually occupied by parents. The realization left me speechless. This had not started recently. It had been happening for years. The next afternoon, another unexpected piece of the puzzle appeared. I received a phone call from the school office regarding an upcoming field trip. The secretary sounded pleasant and professional. We just wanted to confirm emergency contacts. I thanked her and prepared to answer a few routine questions. Then she read the list aloud. David was first. That made sense. I was second. Also normal. Then she mentioned Margaret. And of course we have Margaret Parker listed as primary local contact. Primary local contact. The phrase immediately caught my attention. Primary? I asked. The secretary sounded confused. Yes. My grip tightened around the phone. Can you explain? She paused briefly while reviewing records. According to our notes, Margaret has been designated as the preferred daytime contact for several years. Several years. My mind raced. I certainly had never requested that arrangement. Neither had David as far as I knew. The secretary continued speaking, but I barely heard her. After ending the call, I sat in silence for several minutes. A simple misunderstanding could explain mistaken identities, could not explain official records. Someone had actively positioned Margaret inside systems that should have involved me. For the first time, the situation felt larger than awkward comments and mistaken assumptions. There was documentation, a trail, something tangible. That night, after David came home from work, I asked him a question. Did you ever tell the school to contact your mother before me? His confused expression answered before he spoke. Of course not. I believed him. Which meant neither of us understood how Margaret had become so deeply embedded in Sophie's school life. And as I stared at the school paperwork spread across the kitchen table, I realized I was no longer asking whether something unusual was happening. I was trying to figure out how long it had been happening without either parent noticing. The next morning, I called the school and requested a copy of every contact form associated with Sophie. I expected the process to take days. Instead, the office staff was surprisingly helpful. By late afternoon, I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing a stack of documents that stretched back nearly 3 years. At first, everything looked ordinary. Emergency contacts, permission slips, medical information, routine paperwork completed by parents every year. Then I noticed something unusual. Margaret's name appeared repeatedly, more often than I expected. In some places, she was listed as an additional contact. That seemed reasonable. In others, however, she appeared in positions that made no sense. Several forms described her as a primary family representative. One volunteer registration listed her relationship to Sophie simply as family guardian. My pulse quickened. I knew I had never filled out those sections that way. David had not either. Yet there they were in black and white. I spent the next hour carefully comparing signatures. Most belonged to me or David. A few belonged to school administrators. Then I found something even stranger. Several forms had been updated during the middle of the school year. According to the records, changes had been submitted in person rather than electronically. The updates included additional contact permissions connected to Margaret. I stared at the dates. Every one of them corresponded to periods when Margaret frequently helped with school pickups. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just enough involvement to gradually expand her presence inside the school system. The pattern felt deliberate. That evening, David sat beside me as I spread the documents across the dining room table. His expression grew more concerned with every page. "I do not understand this," he admitted. "Mom should not be listed this way." "Exactly." He picked up another form and frowned. "Who approved these changes?" That was the question neither of us could answer. The following day, I arranged a meeting with the school's administrative coordinator. Her name was Mrs. Carson, and she had worked there for nearly a decade. When I explained my concerns, she listened carefully before reviewing the records herself. At first she appeared puzzled. Then she became noticeably uncomfortable. "I think I know what may have happened," she said cautiously. My attention immediately sharpened. "What?" Mrs. Carson folded her hands together. "Margaret has always presented herself as a primary caregiver." The words hit harder than I expected. Presented herself how? Mrs. Carson chose her response carefully. Very involved. Very knowledgeable. She attended meetings. She called frequently. She often discussed Sophie's academic progress in detail. I felt my stomach tighten. Did she ever tell anyone she was Sophie's mother? Mrs. Carson hesitated. The pause told me everything. "Not directly," she finally said. "But she also never corrected people when assumptions were made." I closed my eyes briefly. It was exactly what I had witnessed at the school ceremony. Not a direct lie. Something more subtle. A silence that allowed others to draw the wrong conclusion. Mrs. Carson continued. "Over time, many staff members simply assumed she occupied a parental role. I thanked her and left the meeting with more answers than I expected and more questions than I wanted. That afternoon I picked Sophie up from school myself. As we walked toward the parking lot, she slipped her small hand into mine. "Mom," she asked. "Yes. Why have you been asking so many questions about Grandma?" The question caught me off guard. I smiled gently. "What makes you ask that?" Sophie shrugged. "Grandma asked me if everything was okay." My heart immediately skipped a beat. Margaret knew. Somehow, she already knew I was looking into the situation. I kept my voice calm. "And what did you tell her?" Sophie smiled. "I said everything was fine." I squeezed her hand and smiled back. Yet inside my concern deepened. Until that moment, my investigation had felt private. Now I realized Margaret was paying attention. Very close attention. That evening, as I reviewed my notes from the school meeting, my phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was Margaret. The message contained only one sentence. "Emily, I think we should talk before you hear things from people who do not know the whole story." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I slowly set the phone down. Because for the first time since this began, it sounded like Margaret herself was finally ready to explain why she had spent years stepping into a role that was never hers. I stared at Margaret's message for nearly an hour before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it entirely. Another part knew that if I truly wanted answers, I had to hear what she had to say. Finally, I agreed to meet her the following afternoon at a small coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods. When I arrived, Margaret was already there. She sat alone at a corner table holding a cup of tea. For the first time since all of this began, she looked nervous. Not defensive. Not confident. Nervous. I took a seat across from her and waited. Margaret folded her hands together and looked down for several seconds before speaking. "I know what people at the school have been saying." I remained silent. She continued. "And I know how it must look." I thought about the teachers, the volunteers, the administrative records, and the countless assumptions that had somehow followed us for years. "Then explain it to me," I said calmly. Margaret sighed. "It did not start the way you think." The answer immediately frustrated me. "Then tell me how it started." For a moment she seemed to struggle with where to begin. Finally she looked up. "When Sophie was born, I was terrified." The statement caught me off guard. Terrified of what? Margaret's eyes softened. Losing another child. I frowned. Another child. The phrase felt important. Important enough that I had never heard it before. Margaret stared into her tea before continuing. Before David was born, I had a daughter. My heart skipped. In all the years I had known her, she had never mentioned another child. Not once. What happened? I asked quietly. Margaret swallowed hard. She passed away when she was very young. The pain in her voice sounded genuine. Not rehearsed. Not manipulative. Genuine. I am sorry, I said softly. Margaret nodded. Most people do not know about her. Even David barely remembers because he was so young when it happened. The pieces did not fully connect yet, but I could already feel the direction of the conversation changing. Margaret continued. When Sophie was born, something happened that I never expected. Her eyes filled with emotion. She reminded me of my daughter. I listened carefully. Not just physically, Margaret said. Her personality. Her smile. The way she laughed. She paused. It felt like a part of my life I thought was gone forever had somehow returned. For the first time, I began to understand the emotional roots of what had happened. Understanding, however, did not erase the consequences. That still does not explain the school records, I said. Margaret nodded slowly. I know. She looked genuinely ashamed. At first, I just wanted to be involved. Her voice grew quieter. Then people started assuming things. I already knew where this was going. And you did not correct them. She lowered her eyes. No. The honesty was painful because it confirmed everything I had suspected. Why? Margaret's answer came almost immediately. Because it felt good. The simplicity of the response stunned me. She continued before I could react. Not because I wanted to replace you. Because for a few moments, people looked at Sophie and saw me as someone important in her life. Ist daher. You were important in her life. Margaret shook her head. Not the way a parent is. Silence settled between us. After several seconds, she added something that changed my perspective again. The problem is that I stopped recognizing the difference. Those words felt more honest than anything she had said so far. Margaret explained how years of volunteering, attending events, helping with pickups, and speaking with teachers gradually blurred boundaries she should have respected. Nobody challenged the assumptions, so she stopped challenging them herself. Eventually, the role she imagined in her head started influencing the role she presented to others. I never told people I was Sophie's mother, she said. But I allowed them to believe things that were not true. Hearing her admit it out loud mattered. Yet one question still remained. Why did the school records change? Margaret hesitated again. Then she confessed something I had not expected. Because a few years ago, I was afraid something would happen to you. Ist daher. What? Margaret looked embarrassed. You were working long hours. David was traveling frequently. I convinced myself Sophie needed another adult listed everywhere just in case. That explanation sounded partly reasonable and partly troubling. The deeper issue remained the same. She had made decisions that belonged to Sophie's parents. As our conversation ended, Margaret looked directly at me. I know I crossed lines. Her voice trembled slightly. I just do not think I realized how many until now. As I drove home afterward, I kept replaying everything she had said. For the first time, I understood the emotions behind her behavior. But understanding why something happened and deciding what to do about it were two very different things. And I knew a much harder conversation was still waiting for all of us. For the next several days, I found myself thinking about Margaret's confession more than I expected. Part of me felt sympathy for the loss she had carried for decades. Another part could not ignore the reality of what her choices had done. Both things could be true at the same time. A person could be hurting and still cross boundaries. A person could have good intentions and still cause harm. The more I reflected on our conversation, the more I realized this situation was no longer about discovering what had happened. The facts were clear. Margaret had allowed people to believe she occupied a parental role in Sophie's life. She had gradually inserted herself into spaces that belonged to David and me. The real question now was how our family would move forward. A few days later, David and I sat together after Sophie had gone to bed. I shared everything Margaret had told me. He listened quietly, occasionally staring at the table as though processing memories of his own. When I finished, he remained silent for several seconds. Finally he spoke. I never knew how much losing my sister affected her. I nodded. Neither did I. David leaned back in his chair. That explains some things. But not all of them, I replied. He immediately agreed. No, not all of them. That conversation marked an important turning point. For the first time since the school event, David stopped viewing the situation as a misunderstanding and started recognizing it as a family problem that needed to be addressed. We agreed that avoiding the issue would only allow it to continue. The following weekend, we invited Margaret to our house for dinner. Sophie was excited to see her grandmother and spent most of the evening talking about an upcoming reading competition at school. Watching them together reminded me why this situation felt so complicated. Margaret genuinely loved Sophie. There was never any doubt about that. The problem was not love. The problem was boundaries. After Sophie went upstairs to work on a school project, David joined Margaret and me at the dining room table. The atmosphere remained calm, but everyone understood why we were there. Margaret looked nervous again. David took a deep breath before speaking. Mom, Emily told me about your conversation. Margaret nodded slowly. I figured she would. David folded his hands together. I understand some of what you were feeling. His voice remained gentle. But I also need you to understand what this looked like from our side. Margaret lowered her eyes. I know. For the next hour we talked more honestly than we ever had before. There were no accusations. No raised voices. Just difficult truths. I explained how isolated I felt during the school ceremony. I described the embarrassment of repeatedly being mistaken for someone other than Sophie's mother. David shared his concerns about the school records and the decisions that had been made without our knowledge. Margaret listened carefully. Several times she apologized. Not the quick apologies people offer to end uncomfortable conversations. Real apologies. The kind that require acknowledging specific actions and accepting responsibility for them. At one point, Margaret looked directly at me. I never wanted Sophie to think you were less important than me. I believed her. Yet I also knew intentions did not erase impact. She never thought that, I said. But other people did. And eventually that started affecting how I felt too. Margaret's expression softened with sadness. She understood. Near the end of the conversation, David brought up something neither of us had discussed before. What happens next? The room fell quiet. It was a simple question, but it carried enormous weight. After a moment I answered. We create clear boundaries. Margaret nodded immediately, almost too quickly, as though she already knew that answer was coming. We discussed school communications, parent meetings, volunteer activities, and emergency contacts. Everything needed to reflect reality. Grandmother, not parent. Supportive family member, not primary decision maker. The conversation was uncomfortable at times, but it remained respectful. By the end of the evening, something important had changed. For years, assumptions had shaped our relationships. Now expectations were finally being spoken out loud. As Margaret prepared to leave, she paused near the front door. I cannot change what happened, she said quietly. But I want to do better. I appreciated the honesty. Yet actions would matter more than promises. And as I watched her drive away that night, I realized the true test would not come during difficult conversations around a dining room table. It would come at the next school event, when everyone would have the opportunity to choose whether those new boundaries were real. The next school event arrived sooner than I expected. Sophie's reading competition had become the main topic of conversation in our house for weeks. Every afternoon, she practiced reading passages aloud at the kitchen table, while I timed her and helped her work through difficult words. Watching her prepare reminded me why I had fought so hard to protect my place in her life. Parenting was built from thousands of small moments that nobody else saw. The homework sessions, the bedtime talks, the encouragement after disappointment, the celebrations after success. Those moments mattered. On the morning of the competition, I felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. Not because of the event itself, because this would be the first major school function since our family conversation. Part of me wondered whether anything would actually be different. Another part hoped it would. When we arrived at the school, the atmosphere felt familiar. Parents carried coffee cups through the hallways. Children practiced speeches and reading assignments. Volunteers organized programs near the entrance. For the first time in weeks, I noticed something immediately. My name appeared clearly on the welcome list at the registration table. The volunteer smiled as I approached. "Good morning, Mrs. Parker. Sophie is checked in and ready to go." Such a simple interaction should not have felt significant. Yet it did. There was no confusion. No hesitation. No mistaken assumptions. Just recognition. A few minutes later, David arrived and joined us. Then Margaret walked through the entrance. I quietly observed the interaction that followed. The same volunteer greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Parker. It is nice to see Sophie's grandmother again." Grandmother. The word landed gently but powerfully. Margaret smiled and nodded. "Thank you." Nothing more. No awkwardness. No correction required. Just the truth presented naturally. For the first time, I felt some of the tension inside me begin to ease. As families gathered inside the auditorium, another change became apparent. Several staff members greeted me directly. Mrs. Reynolds stopped to ask how Sophie had been preparing. The office secretary updated me on the event schedule. The reading coordinator confirmed seating arrangements with me personally. None of these interactions were dramatic. Yet together they represented something important. The school finally understood who Sophie's parents were. More importantly, everyone involved seemed comfortable with that reality. During the competition, Sophie performed beautifully. She stood confidently at the front of the room and read her selected passage with clarity and enthusiasm. I could not stop smiling. David sat beside me taking photographs while Margaret applauded proudly from her seat. At one point, I glanced in her direction. She looked emotional. Not because attention was focused elsewhere. Because she was genuinely proud of her granddaughter. The distinction mattered. After the awards ceremony ended, families gathered for refreshments in the cafeteria. As people congratulated Sophie, I experienced something that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else. A teacher approached us and said, "You and your husband should be very proud. Sophie has worked incredibly hard. You and your husband, not someone else. Not a vague family member. Her parents. Exactly as it should be." Margaret stood beside us and smiled. Then she said something that surprised me. Emily spent countless evenings helping her practice. The teacher nodded appreciatively and complimented me. For a moment I simply stared at Margaret. She had voluntarily redirected the recognition. Not because anyone asked her to, because she chose to. Later that afternoon, while Sophie celebrated with friends, Margaret and I found ourselves standing together near the school courtyard. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, she broke the silence. "This feels different." I nodded. "It does." She looked across the playground where Sophie was laughing with classmates. For years, I thought being important meant being seen. Her voice remained quiet. Now I think being important means knowing where you belong. The statement stayed with me. Not because it solved everything. Healing rarely happens that way. But because it reflected genuine growth. As we prepared to leave, Mrs. Carson approached us with updated school contact forms. Everything had been revised. Parent information was accurate. Emergency contacts were organized correctly. Roles were clearly defined. I reviewed the paperwork and felt an unexpected sense of relief. What began with confusion and embarrassment had finally produced clarity. Yet as I looked at the corrected forms in my hands, I realized the paperwork itself was not the real victory. The real victory was that everyone involved now understood the difference between love and ownership, between support and control, and between being a grandmother and trying to become something more. Several months later, life looked remarkably different from the way it had looked on the day everything began. The changes were not dramatic or theatrical. There were no grand speeches, no perfect resolutions, and no magical moment that erased every mistake. Instead, there was something much more valuable. There was consistency. Boundaries that had once existed only in my mind were now respected in everyday life. School emails came directly to David and me. Parent meetings involved parents. Grandparent activities involved grandparents. The roles were clear, and because they were clear, everyone seemed more comfortable. Even Sophie noticed the difference. although not in the way adults might expect. One evening while we were driving home from soccer practice, she sat in the back seat looking out the window. "Mom?" she asked. "Yes. Grandma seems happier lately." The observation surprised me. "What makes you think that?" Sophie smiled. "She does not worry as much. Children often see things adults overlook." I thought about her comment for the rest of the drive. In a strange way, Sophie was right. Margaret seemed lighter. For years, she had been carrying grief, fear, and unresolved emotions that influenced her behavior without fully realizing it. Once those feelings were finally acknowledged, she no longer seemed trapped by them. That did not excuse the choices she made, but it helped explain why she made them. As spring turned into summer, our family settled into healthier patterns. Margaret still attended events. She still supported Sophie enthusiastically. She still cheered louder than anyone during soccer games. The difference was that she no longer needed to occupy a role that belonged to someone else. One Saturday morning, I arrived early at another school function and found Margaret already there. She was helping arrange chairs alongside several volunteers. As I walked into the room, one of the teachers smiled and waved. "Sophie's mother is here." Such a simple sentence. Yet hearing it no longer carried anger or relief. It simply felt normal, the way it should have always felt. Margaret looked up and smiled. "Emily, they saved a seat for you in the front row." I thanked her and sat down. There was no tension, no competition, no confusión, just mutual understanding. Later that day, while families gathered outside after the event, Margaret and I found ourselves watching Sophie laugh with friends across the playground. The afternoon sun reflected off the school windows while children ran across the grass. It was an ordinary moment, the kind most people would forget. Yet I knew I would remember it. Margaret turned toward me. "I owe you another apology." I looked at her. She continued before I could respond. "Not because you asked for one. Because I understand things now that I did not understand before." Her voice carried a quiet sincerity. I thought loving Sophie gave me permission to step closer. I never realized I was pushing you farther away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I answered honestly, "I know you love her." Margaret nodded. "And I know you are her mother." The words sounded simple, but they represented years of misunderstanding finally coming to an end. As I watched Sophie playing in the distance, I realized something important. Throughout this entire experience, I had spent so much energy trying to reclaim my place that I almost forgot something essential. My place had never actually been taken. The people who mattered most already knew who I was. Sophie knew. David knew. Deep down, even Margaret knew. The confusion existed in paperwork, assumptions, and perceptions. It never existed in the bond between a mother and her child. That realization brought a peace I had not expected. Looking back now, I do not think the most important lesson was about school records or public recognition. It was about boundaries. Healthy families require love, but they also require clarity. When roles become blurred, even good intentions can create pain. When boundaries are respected, relationships become stronger rather than weaker. As we left the school that afternoon, Sophie ran toward us holding a ribbon she had earned. Without thinking, she reached for both of our hands. One hand found mine. The other found Margaret's. Together we walked toward the parking lot beneath the warm afternoon sun. Grandmother, mother, granddaughter. Each person exactly where they belonged. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough.